Did human beings evolve, or were we created in God's image? And does it even matter? I mean, we're faced with so many issues today, social justice issues, issues about other types of injustices in our world. So why should we spend time debating about our origins and arguing about evolution? I'm joined today by Dr. Joe Miller, a Christian scholar, who's going to help us answer some of those questions. Joe, welcome.
Yeah, it's good to be here. Thanks for having me, Fuzz.
Yeah. So first question is, why should the average person on the street care about an academic debate about the origin of humanity?
Yeah, that's actually a great question because I get that a lot, and I understand that there's a concern like, hey, we're getting overly academic, or they're too much into science, or too much into biblical doctrines that don't seem to connect to the real issues that drive people's passions or the urgencies that we see in the world around us. And so I guess the easiest way to illustrate the importance of this, going beyond just the halls of academia or the walls of a church kind of issue, back in the 60s, at the height of the civil rights movement in Birmingham, Alabama, there was a sanitation strike. And these African-American, these black workers had all these signs, and the signs said, "I am a man." And these signs are iconic in terms of this moment in history and what it meant for black civil rights and liberties in the United States. But the reason that sign was so important is because, in part, it wasn't just about they didn't have political freedoms or that there was problems, stemming from Jim Crow era type laws or segregation laws. It's that people looked at them and said, "You're not really a human being. You're less than a human." And that debate, that battle goes back 100 years to the time of Darwin and beyond him, even before him, to be honest. But, it came to a head, this sort of, at least the scientific arguments against the full humanity of certain people groups. And so if we're going to really address the concerns of those men who are having to fight for their rights to say, "I am a man," then we need to care about this type of issue.
Yeah, so how does a biblical perspective weigh in on this question then?
Yeah. Well, I think it's really important because whether we look at Christians in the past who have done unjust things or non-Christians in the past, I mean, they're both have equally committed many sins. So that's on the table. We all understand that. But I think in my study, what I've looked at and what I've seen in history is that those Christians who've been guided by a strong biblical hermeneutic, that have a clear understanding of biblical doctrine, and then tried to consistently apply that to those social issues, they were constrained. They were held back from just following the crowd. And so if we're going to stand against the tide when it's not always acceptable to stand against injustice, then we've got to be tied and moored to something that transcends our culture, and that's the importance of a strong biblical worldview and biblical doctrine.
Yeah, and of course, the doctrine that figures centrally in this conversation is the idea that human beings bear God's image. So how does that, connect to social issues like racism?
Yeah, that's actually where I started years ago. It's when I started in even before my PhD stuff, I saw a lot of young people that I spoke with and talked with just didn't really care for understanding the biblical theology. Even in Christians, they're like, well, what does that matter to my life, Mm-hmm. And so I said, well, how can I come up with an issue that people care about and connect that to an important biblical doctrine? And where it came was I looked at the issue of race and said, this is really the boilerplate issue of the day, and this is going to get more and more contentious. What biblical doctrine speaks most directly to that? And I said, well, it's probably human creation, the idea of Adam and Eve created as the sole progenitors of all living humans. And so I started to say, can I make a case that core doctrine provides a clear foundation that protects against dehumanization and against racism? And it took me a lot of years to kind of really know if I could even make a legitimate case for that. But I think there is a clear case that kind of a doctrine really provides the best foundation for working against those kinds of injustices that we see in our world.
Yeah, because as I've heard you say when we've been chatting, is that, really what ultimately flows out of the idea of the image of God is that each human being is sacred.
Yeah.
It's not only that there's infinite value and worth to human lives, but but as
Yeah.
image bearers, we are sacred beings.
Yeah, and that's the struggle. I mean, that's really the linchpin. It's such a. I remember when I first started to write the idea of human sacredness, or we are sacred beings instead of human dignity, right? The problem with words like dignity, and all people on all sides will acknowledge it's a squishy word. We don't really know what it means, and we can't really define it. Even the UN Declaration on Human Rights recognizes that it doesn't even make an attempt to say, we don't even know what the foundation is, but you can come up with your own foundation. We're just going to assert these are human rights based on human dignity. But they agreed there's no consensus on what even guaranteed those things outside of any one particular cultural perception or worldview. But the problem is when our rights are tied to culture, the rights can be diminished when the culture shifts. And so that really is the idea. So tying human sacredness is more than just a language change. It's more than just an ideological shift. It's saying our value is tied to something that transcends culture and transcends politics.
Yeah, and of course, from a Christian worldview perspective, if every human being is sacred because they bear God's image, then it's the idea that the way you're treating another human being would be the way that you would be treating God Himself as as image bearers, and that's profound, right?
Yeah, it's that even my own body doesn't belong to me. Your body doesn't. We belong to God who created us. We are caretakers for the bodies, this world that He gave us. He's given us. So issues like even environmental care or human care, they all tie to the fact that our obligation rests with the God who made us. And when that's the case, we realize I have a standard that I have to live to that's higher than what any culture sets, or even what I might think is comfortable for me personally. Like I have to live my own life in a way that honors the God who made me, and because I'm His.
Now let's compare the Christian perspective on this issue with an evolutionary view for human origins. What is the implications if we are the product of an evolutionary history when it comes to, again, social issues like racism?
Yeah, Darwin's actually a pretty good example of the struggle that's faced, especially from that naturalist worldview. So Darwin was a guy who was really opposed to the institution of slavery. He understood that he saw it as an evil. He saw it as a terrible evil. But at the same time, he believed that blacks were all by nature inferior to white European races. Not inferior in the sense of permanency, because he said, it sort of ebbed and flowed with different circumstances. So given different world circumstances, the blacks could have been superior to whites. So him wasn't a permanent state, but still, given the state we lived in, he said they are not as capable of survival. And so he ended up arguing essentially that just like the black ants, you could see slavery amongst the animals, you could see that in the human systems, and there was no moral argument against that. Even though he opposed it, he knew that he couldn't leverage a naturalist argument against it. And so that was the challenge he faced, and I think it's something he struggled with because he realized even his theory, as much as he wanted it to end those institutional systems that were oppressive, he really saw no way.
So the history of evolutionary anthropology, though, is really riddled with, with racism, right? I'm thinking of Carlton Kuhn and his multi-regional ideas, and he was the one who codified the different racial groups. And of course, I think Darwin's ideas were really the fodder for eugenics, right?
Yeah. So Darwin himself, it was his cousin, Francis Galton, in England, who really coined that term eugenics, which just means good breeding. And so when we look at eugenics, there's really three kinds. What Galton said was his cousin Darwin described this sort of natural eugenics, where nature itself is taking care of what are the fittest, what are the less fit, and nature by its own course through natural selection will select out those who are less fit. And he said, well, if nature is doing that, we as humans, a product of nature, should be cooperating with the course of nature. So we can have positive eugenics where people just say, hey, look, I'm going to be really careful who I have children with. I don't want to pick somebody who's poor because we know poverty is sort of a genetic defect. At least that was the argument at the time. Certain racial groups are less than whites, so we don't want to interbreed certainly the whites with the blacks. And so that was a sort of a positive eugenics, my choices. But then there was negative, which was forced sterilizations, where blacks, Tuskegee experiments. Blacks for 40 years were experimented on in a very dishonest way by the U.S. government, but all that stemmed from this worldview that that black bodies were expendable, that somehow they were less fit and they didn't deserve the protections that others did. And so that worldview you see extend throughout science, and it really codified in the systems and structures of education and science and in government.
I mean, today you see many evolutionary anthropologists doing everything they can to distance themselves from their very racist past. And so today, most evolutionary anthropologists would argue against racism.
Yes, exactly.
Because of the out of Africa idea. Maybe just briefly unpack that.
Yeah, so part of what happened is, especially in the 1960s, there was this, especially once it was known what Hitler was doing based on these eugenic and Darwinian ideas and how he had, what he had accomplished, so to speak, in a negative way in terms of cleansing society from what he thought were the less pure. People said, well, gosh, we don't want to go down that line. How do we separate ourselves from that? And so you had guys like Kuhn who were still writing these articles arguing ostensibly for segregation and the inferiority of blacks that were used by Southern segregationists as a science basis for that sort of segregation and discrimination. But then you have guys like Theodore Dobromsky who said, well, no, we can't accept what Kuhn has. But his argument was interesting. He said, it's not that we disagree with his science, it's just that we know that that science leads to bad social ends, therefore we cannot accept the science. So they had to have a way to get around the science, and that was by saying, well, race is just a social construct. It's invented, it's a fiction of culture, which actually historically is really true, because it's a construct that came from like Kant and Hume before Darwin ever got his hands on it and made it scientific in that sense. But so they thought by separating the concept of race from genetics, they could protect people, they could do it. But in the end, it didn't really do that, because even saying we have common origin, we're all biologically similar, it doesn't matter, because there's still other metrics that people use, whether it's consciousness or intelligence or physical ableness, how if somebody's physically disabled or not. There's still other metrics that we use as a society to justify those tribalist type discrimination.
Yeah. Well, Joe, thank you. This has been really informative. And to answer our question, it really does matter what we think about our origins, and different worldview perspectives cash out very differently and do have an impact how we respond to really the most important issues of our day.
Yeah, thanks for having me. That's been a blessing.